Hello, I am Panos Kodzathanasis, and this is ASEAN Movie Pulse Interviews. Today I'm here with Wafa Ghermani, who is a specialist of Taiwanese cinema. How are you, Wafa?
Hi, Panos. I'm okay, thank you.
Okay, nice to have you here. So let's take things from the beginning. How did you start being involved with cinema, and particularly Taiwanese cinema?
I think I have always loved cinema since I'm a kid, because my mom would take me to some kind of cine club in the city I grew up in, and I really loved silent films and old film as a kid. And then also as a kid, I really had a passion for Asian culture and especially Chinese culture. And Taiwan, it was more later, because when I started watching a lot of Asian films, and I really liked Taiwan films. But at some point, I went to China when I was 21. And after that, I met a guy who became my language exchange, because I started studying Chinese, and he was Taiwanese. And I realized that I had a better communication with Taiwanese people rather than with Chinese people. So I decided to go for Taiwan. And Taiwan was not that much studied at the time in comparison with Chinese cinema. So yeah, I thought it was a good, a change for once, not to study Chinese cinema, but Taiwan only.
And you have been cooperating with the French Cinematech. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yes, I've been, my work with French Cinematech goes way back, maybe more than 15 years ago. I started first as an intern, and I was in a department where I'm working now, which is more in charge of promoting the film collection there. But while I was there, the head of the film collection told me they just got 150 films, Taiwanese films, that were given to them. And because I could speak some Chinese, they asked me if I could do the inventory of the films. So that's how I started working on their collection, on their Taiwanese film collection. And it was really interesting to see that the films they got were films from the 70s with the Vietnamese and French subtitles that made me understand that this film were aimed at the newly moved Chinese communities from Vietnam who had fled the war and the civil war. So I started like that there, and afterwards I went to Taiwan for my PhD. So I was in France back and forth, and I went on working with them for like short contract. And finally, 5 years ago, nearly 6 years ago, I was offered a permanent job there. So I worked in the event department first, but I also did some film programming, and now I'm back in the film promotion department, where I do like film programming too, and working on all the print lending process. But also we have this VOD free worldwide platform called Henry, and I'm working on this too. So all this process and also film programming there with my colleagues.
Okay, and you only deal with Taiwanese or Chinese cinema again there, or all kinds of cinema?
There, it's all kind of cinemas. Like being at Cinematech, our collection is like super wide. So I've been working recently. I've tried to have a look on the Syrian collection of film we have, for example, or even the early films like the first sound experiences made at the beginning of the 20th century. But on the platform, more specifically, indeed, and more focused on Asian cinema, but because I did a retrospective of Thai film, like the last one that is on now is Hong Kong, is a tribute to the Fresh Wave Film Festival right now. Or there was a Taiwanese retrospective, a Japanese independent movie retrospective, but I also did a retrospective of independent American cinema called American Fringe. So yeah, it's mostly because I love Asian cinema. It's my big cup of tea. So that's mostly Asian cinema, but not only on Henry. And for my work, recently I co-organized big retrospective of early French cinema, or like 20s, 30s French cinema in Taiwan. So it was French cinema. So.
How is the audience reaction to Asian cinema in general in France, let's say?
That's a good question. It really depends. I think people interested in Asian cinema are still kind of a niche somehow. And there is a difference of generation, because I think Panos, if we look at our generation, like when we were young, 20 years ago. No, I don't know how it was in Greece, but for example, in France, we had a lot of Asian cinema all the time. In cinemas, it was really easy to find video tapes at the time, in the first DVDs. So there was a huge opening on Asian cinema. But now when I'm teaching Taiwan cinema and Asian cinema at university too, and we can see there is a big difference. Like most of my students, for example, haven't seen Asian cinema. The only one who love Asian cinema are maybe nerds, but I think I was a nerd. So
we call them buffs now.
Okay. Like there really are some of my students, the one who know more, are like, or have parents who loves maybe a father or mother who is loving Asian cinema, Japanese cinema, or they love genre cinema, for example. But I still think that Asian cinema, but more and more, rather than 20 years ago, is a kind of a niche now. But I know the retrospectives on Henry, the platform, are quite successful with this kind of fans. And at Cinematech, it really depends. If we have Japanese cinema, like big directors, it's always very successful. Like Japanese cinema is always very successful. It's not always the case with Chinese cinema, or Korean cinema is also successful now. But yeah, it's really like Lee Chandong. I remember when we did Lee Chandong a few years back, all the screenings were overpacked, for example. So yeah, it also depends on the name. If we do like general retrospective, maybe it won't be that obvious, but for some directors, it's going to be very successful.
Okay, and can you tell me a bit more about your job teaching Asian cinema?
Sure. So in fact, I've been teaching cinema in two places. One is in a French university, La Sorbonne Nouvelle, and I was taught both in a film department and the cultural mediation department. And I realized that, in fact, cultural mediation students were much more curious than the cinema film students. I don't know why. It was a kind of a big shock, but I always give them a class on Taiwan cinema, which is cultural mediation is kind of way for them to think about how do you teach or how do you talk about completely unknown cinema, because most of them, when I see them for the first time, I always ask them if they've seen Taiwanese film, and most of them never have. So it's kind of how can we get them interested into this kind of films? And what is also quite interesting, it's this experience that before, maybe a few years back, students would work on Ocean or Tsai Ming-liang or mainly, but now they're really watching Netflix, and they're a big fan of the new film, especially the queer film or the romantic films or something like that. So I think it's a really interesting evolution. And most of them, they become quite interested in Taiwanese cinema. And my other class was in the American University of Paris. So it was different university, different students coming from the US, but also all over the world. And some of them liked some Japanese films, but most of them didn't have any idea about it, but they loved film. So it was really different, and they were super enthusiastic about everything. Like every week was a kind of a surprise, because I could give them maybe famous spring in a small town, and they would love it, or Ohio by Ozu, big love, or even Kim Ki-duk film, Three Irons. I wasn't sure they would love it, and they loved it so much. And rewatching the film with distance, I thought it was quite problematic, but not for them. So
okay.
I think it's always very, very interesting experience to have that. I always try to give them some, cultural knowledge so they can grasp some important aspects. But what I really want is that they would like love the film and feeling free to use their own sensibility to do analysis. So not like checking out the knowledge, but trying to have them, I don't know, a free relationship with the films.
Okay. And can you tell me a bit about your collaborations with Audiovisual?
Okay. So Audiovisual, I started working with, the first time I went there, it was in 2000. And I went there because with a friend, with my friend, because we were doing a study on Asian film festivals in France. We were in a university and like third year or second year. And I don't know, we had an essay to do in sociology, film sociology. And so we went to two festivals. One was Vesoul and the other one was the Ville in Asia. And so we arrived there and we knew no one and we really loved it. So after 1 year, I think the Taiwanese came back to me, and because I was starting doing Chinese at the time, and they asked me if I could work with them. So I started working, like helping them with some guests and doing some translations, and more being in charge of the media and film introduction, and sometimes curating programs. And when we met, like I was doing many things, different things. So that's how, and because I worked with them and I went to Taiwan, it was also a great help because I met a lot of Taiwanese people, but not only, like a lot of different people working in films. And it was really like a priceless introduction to festivals, which was something I didn't know before when I was 20. It was a really rich experience. It was massive discoveries in terms of films, and also in terms of different people you can meet, like the moviegoers and directors and like everything around festival. And thanks to them, I think they gave me my first opportunity to do a film program. And I really would like to, I really thank them for that, because yeah, it was the first time someone trusted me and said, okay, do a program, whatever you want. And not completely whatever I wanted, but nearly. And yeah, it gave me this experience of thinking about a film program and how you build a narrative about cinematography to make it acceptable. And Vesoul audience is one of the best in the world because they are super open-minded. And you know, I chose, it was a Taiwanese film program with a 1956 film, a kind of a soft propaganda film with everybody singing at the end. I think all the screening room was clapping in their head at the end, and they loved it. Or a Taiwanese language film, or it was, yeah, I think it was a really great experience there. And it really gave me the taste of this curating work.
And what do you say, there is some connection between French and Taiwanese cinema? Has French cinema some kind of impact in Taiwanese cinema, let's say?
I think there is a kind of double fascination between France and Taiwan cinema. Like, for example, Taiwanese are really obsessed with French New Waves, like many people are. Like, for example, when I introduced my French film program of the 20s and 30s, one of my points was to tell them that, yeah, these were the films that the future directors of the French New Wave would watch at the Cinematech. And somehow, I know it was not New Wave, it was not the most famous time, but it was really important if you want to understand like the French New Wave, you have to see these earlier films to understand this kind of history. And on the other side, I think for French people, Taiwan cinema is kind of very strong aesthetic stance, but somehow it's quite limiting because most of the audience or critics, they're going to see only Ho Xiaoxian, Simon Yang, like Edward Young's film, and they think like Taiwan cinema is only that. And they just erased what is before because they have all read what Peggy Chow have written, saying, okay, before Taiwan new cinema, there was nothing. And so there is this kind of strange relationship and a kind of inequality, because you have a lot of French movies being released in Taiwan. I think it's nearly up to 50, more than 50 French films are released in Taiwan every year. And but we don't have so many Taiwanese films here. Mm-hmm. But Netflix is somehow changing it a little. And yeah, and I think for some French critics and directors, Tsai Ming-yong or Ho Xiaoshen are kind of gods, and they are considered as one of the most prominent and important directors in the world. So there is this kind of double views on both from France and in Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell me a bit about the Taiwan Film Institute? As far as I can see, it's doing a tremendous job restoring old films and promoting festivals all across the world.
Well, that's kind of a complicated story they have, because before 1979, there was nothing in Taiwan in terms of, like keeping films. A big studio could keep their own films, but you had all these very commercial companies that will just shoot the film and then throw them away, and that was it. So first of all, they established kind of library, and then it's changed from this kind of library to a film archive. And it really, the tremendous change was at the beginning of the 90s with a new director called Ting Roy. And he's a crazy guy. He's really the Taiwanese Henri Langlois. So he started to save all the films that were made in the 60s that were really, really hard to find, and also to interview with all his staff. They interviewed the old actors, technicians, directors. They really tried to save all this memory of the film of the 60s, not only, of course, the official one, but especially the unofficial ones that had nearly disappeared. So first they kept the film, and then they did some transfer. And more recently, thanks to the evolution of digitization, it was easier to save the films. So first, I think the strategy was first to restore Ho Xiaoshen film, for example, and then because of some political move in Taiwan, when you go from a Chinese nationalist government to a more Taiwanese favored government. So afterwards, there was kind of and recently a movement towards all these popular Taiwanese language films that were restored and digitized, and they have their own scan, so they are doing their own work. They don't have to. Before that, they had to work with Imaginaire Retrodata Hong Kong, so it was more expensive and complicated. But now they really have their own facilities to save movies. But the strategy, it's also between economics and politics, I think. It's kind of like, for example, the former national studio, CNPC, the choice of restoration is somehow, for me, disturbing, because they restore their propaganda war films. Like, who wants to see them? Like, no one. You cannot sell that. It's really hard, and it's not good news. So it's. But recently, for example, you have the Li Xin film. Like, Li Xin was this big official director of the 60s, and it's going to be restored next year. Or recently, there was this film Typhoon by Pan Lei. And this one was a surprise, because I know, like, more than 10 years ago, I was always pushing for this film to be restored, because I thought it was one of the best of the 60s, very different, out all these propaganda things, and really an art cinema film. And it was never, on the table, even if some people were like supporting me. And it got finally restored, because it was restored for free. By a sponsor in Japan. And well, that's a film that works quite well now, so I'm quite happy about that, and it's kind of changed the view or the discourse we have on it. So you've seen it, yes, you've seen it.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great one. It's a really good film.
Yeah, frankly, like 10
yeah.
years. I saw it on a terrible videotape, and I fell in love with it. And so now they're more pushing for a Taiwanese language film, but like the choice they do, I don't know, it's not always a choice I would do, like in terms of restoration, because I love the comedies, for example, and then sometimes I'm more pushing for the melodramas. And I'm like, no, comedies are really interesting because you see all this transformation, modernization, and I think it's the same thing that you see in every country in the 60s. I'm sure in Greece or in France or in South America, in fact, you have all these kind of comedies of like, poor people from the countryside going to the city and and I think it's really interesting to see this kind of like what happened in the world at the same time, and they are also really critical of the policy of the time, of the not openly against dictator, but still you have some harsh comments on the social transformation of Taiwan at the time. So I think, something really interesting.
Since you mentioned the restorations, do you have maybe a rough estimate? How much does it cost to restore a film nowadays?
It depends. If it's Napoleon by Abel Gance, it's millions, like more than, Otherwise, it really depends if you just digitize the film or if you really restore it afterwards. I don't know, it can be nearly 30,000 euros.
It's not expensive, yeah. Okay.
And 30,000 euros wouldn't be that expensive. I think between 10,000, 30,000, 50,000. I'm not into this technical aspect, but yeah.
And how would you describe the present of Taiwanese cinema? How is Taiwanese cinema at the moment?
I think because it's becoming harder for Taiwan cinema to be distributed in theaters, now they're really counting on the platforms and Netflix and everything. Otherwise, I think there is a change, but maybe my view is deformed because of my work. I think older cinema, like classical cinema, is more present now because of the restoration, because of all the film programs that were made. For example, I worked with Chris Berry from King's College, Ming Ramsey and Corrado Neri from Lyon 3, together on this Taiwanese language film tour around Europe. And it started really in universities, and now it's more and more in festivals. And one can see that more and more festivals are interested in this kind of film. So we can really see kind of new presence of Taiwan cinema everywhere. And it's as if, I was kind of quite part of that, film of the 60s now are part of the reality, which was not the case beforehand. When I started my research, for example, it did not exist. And now it's something that is, film fans know about it, like have heard of some of the films of the 60s, for example. So maybe not recent film are not that present anymore, but maybe classical cinema is more and more present thanks to DVDs or some special program around the world. Like in the US, you have a lot too, in Europe too. It's kind of paradoxical, I think, because we did program in Europe. So now Taiwan is interested in their own classical films. It's kind of a strange movement.
And you have been to Taiwan a number of times. How is the situation there now with China and all that is happening? Are people afraid? How are they?
Well, I'm just back from Taiwan.
Okay.
You mean the situation politically?
Yeah.
In fact, there was, because of the war in Ukraine, there was a kind of new conscience about it. And in fact, Taiwanese people have been very, very generous with Ukraine. They have given tons of goods and medication and everything, and a lot of money, like millions, to Ukraine. So I don't know, it's a kind of because I think it feels the same situation. And but in everyday life, it's not as if you could feel something. Really, even if you have Chinese planes entering the territory and everything, I think it's between, you know, this kind of fear and at the same time just life going on. But yeah, you can still see like more and more, for example, Hong Kong directors are moving to Taiwan. Like next week on Henry, we're going to put a short film called 3 Days to Generation by a French, not French, sorry, a female director called Zhu Hoi-in. And she's now, like, she's been in Taiwan for many months. She's sure she's going to go back to Hong Kong. Xiaonian May You Stay Forever Young director Lamson has just moved to London, for example. Like many, like you can feel that Taiwan is also having like this new migration from Hong Kong. And also, I think researcher now, because they cannot go to China, tends to move to Taiwan.
But we don't see many Taiwanese films about this, what is happening with China. For example, we see a lot from Hong Kong, and we have been seeing for years. So why do you think that is?
Because I think reaction, it's, I think it's no relationship, but still, you know, it's really funny. If you have seen the last Taiwanese film of the last years, they are all dealing with pandemic. Even if there was no pandemic at the time there. But I think for China, in fact, you had some film a few years back about Chinese-Taiwan relationships, you know, like the kind of love stories and blah, blah, blah. But recently, maybe it's not the, and also because, you know, some Chinese some Taiwanese commercial movies, they want to be distributed in China. So they don't want to talk about it either. So, or you have some maybe more art house films, and for them the relationship with China is not that important because they are Taiwanese. They don't always, they won't define themselves always with China or in China. And if you have very commercial film which are trying to be sold outside Taiwan and in China, you better not touch anything. But you have this kind of films. I think what is quite interesting to see how some films are really neutral, you know, in terms of places. We don't know where it is. Or there was this film called, in Chinese is Da E, I forgot the English name. No, about a girl who is overweight and forced to lose weight.
I know the film. I don't remember the titles, but I know the film. Yeah,
but it's quite an interesting film because it's shot in this new city. In fact, it's Taichung, but it's really hard to know where it is shot. You have absolutely no way of knowing it could be shot anywhere. It's like you have no particular, maybe except for the accent of the people, you don't really have any particularities or any sort. It's kind of very neutral film. So this kind of thing. So, but yeah, you're right. The last film I've seen are not really dealing with that. In commercial cinema, not in a documentary.
Okay. And do Taiwanese people go to the cinemas to watch Taiwanese films?
Not really. No, they went during the first year of the pandemic because all the film distribution from the US was stopped. So it was a great year for Taiwan cinema. So everybody wanted to see Taiwanese cinema, and some film became big success, and it was a surprise. But otherwise, no, the part of Taiwan cinema is really reduced in Taiwan because there are no real, you know, quota for Taiwan cinema. They don't do what they should, like what they did in Korea, and it's an open market to Hollywood cinema. So that's the price protection of the US, I think. That's import of meat. So. No, and when I went there, I wanted to watch film, but I didn't have the time. I had too much work to do. But yeah, it was kind of worrying, and even festivals, like there was the TIDF, the Taiwan International Documentary Film Festival, which is normally a big thing, and not so many people went there for example. It was far less than before. They were quite worried, but also maybe because you know the new TFAI, where the documentary film festival takes place partly, is very far away in suburbia, and it's very not easy to go there by public transport. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now because Taiwan's situation with COVID is quite worrying, with a lot of people getting infected. So people are not really encouraged to watch movies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, and last question, and I kept the hardest one for last. How much sense does it make nowadays financially, I mean, to be a film academic?
I don't know. I'm not working in the academia, in fact. Mm. I'm working in a film archive.
Okay.
So maybe, but
because I mean, like filmmakers say it doesn't make sense. Like producers say it doesn't make sense. Actors say that it doesn't make sense. So what about the people that actually work around cinema, not exactly inside? You know, that's what I'm asking.
I think it always makes sense to be in the academia somehow. It's the most doesn't make sense in making sense thing, because it would be very easy to say, why would students go to universities? They should better learn a job and work. And so it's also a way of constraining your freedom. So I think being in the academia and studying film really allows you to give you some power and maybe very selfishly in the academia. And when I start my studies on Taiwan cinema, no one cared about film of the 60s, and now it has become a kind of topic. Like I'm working with like Chris Mingyan and Corrado of a new book on Taiwanese language film cinema, and we got a lot of proposition from people who previously wouldn't have worked on that. So I think it's really a new topic, and to see and to have the kind of making you aware of some social significance or of past significance, I think it's kind of important. Maybe it's a very small world, but that's why for me it's really important to keep academic and my creating jobs together, because to do only research on one topic but not having people like see what I'm working on is not that interesting. But I like to have both, so I think nothing makes sense somehow. So yeah, like the work panels, like talking about like that.
It's a passion, right? It's not.
Yeah, I think it's most of academic people are because are out of passion, and you try to have you share your passion. Even as a professor, like as a teacher, like I'm teaching Taiwan cinema. When at my first class, most of my students say they haven't seen one film. Maybe they've seen Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And at the end, they love the film. And once, a few months back, I met one of my former students. I didn't recognize her because she had a mask. So she went to me and said, "Hey, man, professor." And she told me, because of you, I've become a big fan of Taiwan cinema. And there is this and this film on Netflix I haven't seen yet. And I wanted to go to Korea, but now I would like to go to Taiwan. I said, wow, if you're going from someone who has no idea about Taiwan and Taiwan cinema to someone getting suddenly interested, I'm like, well, it's not that senseless. At least you put one country on the map, one cinematography on the map. And, the fact that Taiwan is so, it's like specialized on queer cinema, it's kind of soft queer cinema. And for my students, French or like the one from the American university, it was a big surprise. And they started being interested because of that. So you'd see that, okay, it's make them maybe have a new idea about Asia. It's not only a very traditional country, but it's an open-minded, I don't know. It always makes sense. You just have to find your own sense, I think. I think I can find mine, so I don't care with that.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, thank you very much, Wafa. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Panos.
This was ASEAN Movie Pulse interviews, and see you again soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.